Throughout this period, we've been working with the law of group elevation. It is, in part, a reminder of the essential role each and every individual plays in the one group life. In this talk, I will explore the law of group elevation in relation to the prisoners of the planet, both literal and figural. I'll share a bit about my experience inside the prison system with the Alternatives to Violence Project, and how that continues to impact and influence my work, writing, and research at Rowan University. I'll close by sharing a theoretical framework that I've been working on about how writing and story are potential tools for working within the law of limitation toward the law of liberation. A framework intended to help university students learn to oscillate between their personal identity and group identification. As we ascend to the mountaintop, we reach equally to the depths of the world. As we build within, we construct a way onward in rhythm with the ebb and flow of liberation and limitation. And so truly at this time, we do stand at a supreme point of tension between past and future, creating the path forward through the fabric of ourselves. We've learned to revolve upon that pedestal of light, to face the dark, and allow whatever measure of light we have to shine upon the darkened way for our fellow travelers. I reach as high within myself as I can through daily practice and living. And with that, my sense of service continues to expand in all directions, outward, upward, inward, and below. I've learned that what falls in my domain of awareness is my responsibility. Once I saw the multitude of problems in the prison, I couldn't go back to being unaware. Before I understood anything about the phrase prisoners of the planet, an opportunity presented for me to volunteer in the women's prison outside of Denver, not far from where I used to live. The impact of that experience continued to reverberate long after it was complete. And when the opportunity became available again to volunteer in another prison not far from where I now live, I accepted. The problem of the prison system, specifically across the US, since we incarcerate more people per capita than any other country on earth, is that it perpetuates our legacy of slavery. While I recognize that incarceration is a problem around the world, for the limited parameters of this talk, I'll focus on the issue in the US, since it is grossly disproportionate to the rest of the world. As most of you probably all well know, the phrase prisoners of the planet doesn't refer specifically to people who are incarcerated. The Tibetan says, "Let it be remembered always that each field of awareness in its boundaries constitutes a prison, and that the objective of all work of liberation is to release the consciousness and expand its field of contacts. Where there are boundaries of any kind, where a field of influence is circumscribed, and where the radius of contact is limited, there you have a prison." From Treatise on White Magic, page 535. We're called in this passage to a reflection on the endless series of prisons that constitute life. All of the forms in which we work, from the planetary logos to the bodies we inhabit, to this sentence that I wrote, has a circumscribed field of influence. Although some forms are clearly more restrictive than others, it is the form in which we find ourselves where our service is rendered. Through subjective work, eventually we learn the art of liberation, its practice through the interludes of meditation. But we're required to abide within and learn the law of limitation if we hope to practice this art with skill. The Tibetan has presented principles for us to understand how to free the prisoners of the planet. That gives no specific rules, no classifications, no methods or techniques of release. These are up to us to intuitively perceive and intelligently apply. In 2013, I had my first experience inside the prison in Denver, where I was with the Alternatives to Violence project. This project started in the 1970s during a period of heightened prison rioting, where inmates were protesting horrific conditions. A group of inmates upstate New York reached out for support. They contacted some folks who had worked closely with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King during the Civil Rights Movement. And they also reached out to the local Quaker community. Upon this foundation of silence and deep community engagement, a curriculum for alternatives to violence was born. Almost 50 years later, AVP is in about 1,000 prisons around the US and in 35 countries around the world. There are basic tenets upon which every workshop proceeds. Over the course of 3 days, or about 22 hours, the curriculum unfolds through a highly structured group formation. There's a small core group composed of facilitators from the outside and inside of the prison who collaborate to design the flow of the weekend. Exercises are carefully constructed to build a sense of the beloved community by establishing ground rules for respect, by listening and sharing deeply with each other through serious discussion and playful activity, and by learning tools to de-escalate violence under the most difficult of circumstances. Throughout the weekend, we all work in equal measure, side by side, sharing, playing, practicing. This model demonstrates that no one person holds authority. Rather, leadership, insight, and wisdom is diffused in equal measure through the group, a foundational Quaker sensibility. Some of the exercises, like role play, provide a direct link to MLK's work. The role-playing exercises of the civil rights era enabled practitioners of nonviolent resistance to strengthen their capacity to withstand aggression, to train their lower animalistic self not to defend or react to violent invocation, and empower them to strive forward as if the beloved community already existed through a steady commitment to peace. To my mind, the key to the power of this work is in that commitment to strive forward as if the beloved community already exists. It draws on the will and sharpens the ability to shift from an individual identity, which may be mired in impossible circumstances, to a group identification, which in this circumstance is the beloved community. I focus my efforts at Garden State Youth Correctional Facility, a prison for young men 18 to 30 years old who committed felonies while in their youth. AVP utilizes the personal story as a springboard for understanding and transformation, designed to evoke compassion and connection. I can't count the number of times I've witnessed someone who only hours before walked in a hardened shell soon begin to soften and open and lighten through this skillfully crafted group work. On February 22nd of this year, the last time we were able to go in before the pandemic, I went to Garden State Prison for a planning meeting. This is an opportunity for outside facilitators to organize the next workshop with our inside counterparts. These inmates have completed all levels of AVP training while in prison and hold the same certification as any outside AVP facilitator. It is notable that not only was AVP created by inmates, it continues to be led by them. 3 of us met at the prison gate around dusk. We passed through security and waited for the guys to be released from their cells to join us. The prison atmosphere always feels heightened, tense, full of friction, security guards, clanking metal gates, bars, concrete, fluorescent lighting, and filth. To me, it always feels like the astral field is stormy and full of shadow. But on this night, particularly so. This meeting had fallen in the orb of the Pisces new moon, and the energies were uniquely potent. The 3 of us continued to wait longer than usual until we overheard some guards talking. There had been a fight earlier that caused quite a stir and was likely the reason for our delay. Finally, about a dozen of our fellow facilitators strolled in. The first time I went to Garden State, I was unhinged by what looked to me like giant men in their khaki prison uniforms, coming at me. As a little white girl growing up in the Midwest, I had been taught to fear the vision of a group of men of color. Racism is deeply embedded in the fabric of America, and it's an issue that requires vigilant healing, just as the problem of racial minorities around the world is an issue that requires a skillful, attendant heart and a bright mind. The crucial problem, which lies with incorrect race relations, is on full display in prison. People of color constitute an overwhelming majority of the prison population, and most confined youth are held for nonviolent offenses or no crime at all. A link to these is in my talk, so if you need to follow this up, please feel free to request a copy. Through my work with AVP, I feel a deep sense of responsibility and relationship with these guys. It's an impersonal, yet fully personal relationship. It connects me to individuals and what they've been through, but it also connects me to the larger societal problems in which I find myself equally embedded. Our planning session had gotten fully underway, and we were in the middle of an exercise called concentric circles. There's a circle on the inside and one on the outside. For 3 minutes, we answer a question with a partner before rotating to a new partner and a new question. For those of you who have been to the Arcane School conference, when we could be in person, it's like the triangles exercise, but there's 2 people instead of 3. An intimacy is generated as we lean in and listen intently to each other. It's an opportunity to connect, to contemplate a question, and to share reflections. For the guys on the inside, it's a rare opportunity to practice relationship, to listen, to be heard. Suddenly the alarms went off and my nervous system sparked. I stayed in the moment. I focused on the eyes of my partner. I was listening to him share a conflict he was trying to resolve and holding an inward, attentive alignment. I was sitting on the inside circle facing outward, and behind my partner I could see into the hallway. Correctional officers were running and alarms were ringing. I focused back on my partner. More guards were sprinting down the hallway. Then I saw an even larger group of officers return in formation. They had changed into riot gear with full face shields and their helmets on, stab-resistant body shields, and their black batons raised. I had never seen anything like this before, and I struggled to focus on my partner. I looked around and noticed the guys were very nervous. We had an officer stationed with us, and he stood up, and my heart just raced. Later, I learned that this alarm signals a lockdown, and usually the guys have to freeze or get on the floor. They can be locked into whatever room they're in, subjected to extreme pat-downs or worse, depending on the circumstance. I'd never seen the guys look so afraid, and I'd never seen my fellow outside facilitators so nervous. But we steadied our conversations and proceeded with the work. And in that moment, while listening deeply to my partner and seeing everyone around me efforting with such intention, I reached into my own deep pockets of practice and silently recited the mantra of group fusion. And it was as if the beloved community existed. Though outside in the hallway, we could see the chaos, and we could see an inmate being carried in the hall upside down and half dressed, and we could hear screaming, we could feel the fury and the fear and the confusion. Even still, we proceeded as if the beloved community already existed, and in it, we were safe. The code resolved. Eventually, the alarms died down. We proceeded over the next hour to plan our workshop as scheduled for the following weekend, all shaken, but together committed to see the work through. The AVP model teaches that nonviolence isn't necessarily a lack of conflict. Conflict is recognized as a natural extension of the human experience, as the friction of daily life that can kindle the heat to generate change. The Reverend Dr. King articulated how important it was to disturb the sense of contentment of the white population, whose negative passivity allows racial discrimination to thrive. King said more damage was done by folks of goodwill who did nothing than by people who were openly racist. I see prison as one of the densest intersections of the problems of humanity, where the problem of race relations, economic disparity, and education collide. Incarceration concretizes humanity's belief in separation. I was initially surprised by the disparity I found in the prison. It placed me squarely on a path to understand the blind spot of white privilege that I and other white folks share that make it hard to see the ubiquity of racism steadily at work in our society. But when I read in the Problems of Humanity that the spiritual forces in America are on the side of the Black struggle, now I may more clearly understand why. After that experience in prison, I was back to work at the university. I ran across the passage where the Tibetan said, "The world of meaning is the sole world of reality for humanity." And in a recent school letter that Lawrence also mentioned the quote yesterday, another quote by Muriel Rukeyser that said, the world is not made of atoms, it's made of stories." These statements grant enormous power to meaning making and story. I've wrestled deeply with this, how to create the right orientation in relation to such potency. How are we to hold this power without becoming further imprisoned by the stories we create? To work in the field of story, in literal prisons or figural ones, I needed a more vigorous understanding of selflessness, a detached yet loving orientation to my own story that would allow me to work with and through it. And that admittedly took some work. Before the Arcane School, I came from a training where the I was the only trouble, where any sense of a separate self was an affront to unified consciousness, and where any thought of myself was a signal to kill off the ego. Over the years, I've begun to straighten that out, I hope. And through working with my story and listening to the stories of others in prison or at the university, I'm learning to navigate the astral plane with a bit more skill. Our stories can be ripe with emotion and pent-up experience that hasn't yet been harvested for wisdom. In the retelling of a story, a quagmire can unfold. The young folks I work with at the university didn't seem to have the issues with story and identity that I had. They've come up through the school of social media, where carefully curated identities are the key to connection in the internet world, and where the stories they tell link them very closely with each other. Where I struggled to tell my story for fear of overstimulating my personality, they solidified their stories until identities seemed concrete. Perhaps both extremes are overly attached to story and the identity created from it. On the one hand, too tight a hold, on the other, perhaps too loose. The work in the prison has taught me the power of individual story nested within a larger context, and how that can be used as a tool to invoke lighted understanding. And meanwhile, at the university, I became aware of a host of other problems, different from the problems I saw in prison, but also grim. Among them, an unprecedented mental health crisis. Many students struggle with debilitating anxiety and mood disorders. A national poll reveals that anxiety is the top presenting concern among college students, followed by depression and relationship problems. On average, about 25% of students were taking psychotropic medications, although according to my experience, I would suspect the percentage is quite a bit higher. Recently at Rowan, 3 students committed suicide within a 2-month period. I was teaching meditation classes and developing curriculum through the Office of Social Justice, and before quarantine, I was assisting with a class on writing and rhetoric. I struggled to braid together the different threads of my experience related to prison, what I was seeing in academia, writing, teaching, and my esoteric studies. So I began my research into creative forms of nonfiction, ways to use it and teach it that might evoke something higher than the separate self. I looked for ways writing was being taught as a spiritual practice and presented as contemplative approaches to writing. I discovered fields of narrative theory that explore everything from the use of story to ignite social change, to research into healing narrative for end-of-life care. Groups like the Images and Voices of Hope, who spoke years ago at a World Goodwill seminar, use restorative narrative to shift the public dialogue from fear and despair to hope and possibility. Through the course of this research, I've discovered how writing can be used to enter little prisons of thought on the page with the purpose of liberation in mind. How personal identity can be used to enter into limited fields of contact, ideas or experiences or memories, and write a way to an expanded sense of being and back. This oscillation between personal identity and identification with a larger whole decentralizes yet requires the personality. For young folks with a well-developed sense of personality, a methodology that assists them toward a reorientation and expanded sense of self provides practical application in the way of enhanced communication, writing skills, and engaged citizenship, but it also plants the seeds for continued application in spiritual life. I'll briefly touch upon 3 instruments available to work within story in this way: the essay, the ladder of abstraction, and narrative form. So surely you all heard of the essay. It's a common form taught in academia. Unfortunately, the essay has been hijacked and to most students does not sound like any fun. It's an overly structured 5-paragraph, rigid straitjacket where ideas go to die. However, after a little digging on the history of the essay, it's not as limited as it seems. It's an excellent form for this work and is astrologically positioned to serve us in a surprising way. Michel de Montaigne was a French writer in the 1500s. He's credited with the invention of this form. The word essay comes from the French essayer, meaning to try or to attempt to think something through. This freestyle approach led to a form of writing that was entirely distinct from the writing used by the church, which was largely authoritarian and full of answers, not questions, and definitely not free-roaming explorations. The essay was a practice of inquiry, intended to meander across the page in thought. Instead of writing that was dictatorial, the essay would carefully explore one topic after the next, tracked loosely through stream of consciousness, until it arrived at some kind of discovery or new insight. For astrologers in the audience, yes, the emergence of this writing occurred along with the alignment of Saturn and Pluto. And as many of you know, thanks to Kathy Newburn, the last time this alignment occurred, the energies available assisted humanity in an entirely new view of the cosmos. Copernicus published On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. A little Augustine friar named Martin Luther was nailing theses to their church door. Vasco da Gama and others were using this newly invented compass to explore the world. Asia was the center of global trade. A little-known English writer named Will Shakespeare was about to unleash a battalion of plays. And a French fellow, also with a quill in hand, was showing people how to navigate thought on the page without a papal stamp of approval. This was an era of reorientation. Consciousness was expanded in ways previously unimaginable, and this alignment is upon us now. The cycle has returned to offer reorientation and expansion, and we can all likely confirm that the coronavirus has made this reorientation impossible to ignore. And the form of the essay is well suited to pry open vistas of awareness in ways other styles of writing may not. But what I mentioned above isn't the whole story, and we aren't in training to stare blindly into the light. Rather, we're trained to revolve upon that pedestal of light and shine awareness in the dark places. So let's do. During this period of decentralization, Hernan Cortés began a systematic annihilation of the Aztecs, ushering in a smallpox epidemic, which spread across Mexico and devastated the Incan people. There was jihad in Somalia. Civil war raged in countries all around the world. and the transatlantic slave trade was picking up speed. As light rises, so too does the shadow. The second instrument that I'll discuss is called the ladder of abstraction. It's a term developed by the linguist S.I. Hayakawa in 1939. He used the concept to describe how we speak. The further up the ladder we go, the more abstract and vague we become. Further down the ladder we go, the more concrete and detailed we become. And in this talk so far, I've been ascending and descending, sharing abstract concepts and telling concrete details. Story can be thought of as a practice of working upon this ladder of abstraction, propped up between what we experience on the lowest rung and the vision or purpose we see from its highest point. The third and final instrument I'll introduce for today is the traditional tool of narrative building, which includes setting, situation, characters, conflict, and the story arc. You've likely seen it drawn out as a line with a blip in the middle. It resembles one heartbeat on an EKG, but that's really just the beginning of it. Narrative is not fossilized. It is evolving, shape-shifting form. As long as narrative lines are taught as simple blips, as storylines that run separate, then our shared story, which is complex and interpenetrating all of life, is hard to see. The construction of new forms for storylines are well underway, forms that reveal our indivisible reality with each other that aren't bound to a linear blip. So with these three simple tools, the essay, the ladder of abstraction, and new forms of narrative, we have a methodological approach to writing that is intended to draw upon the vision of the soul. A student or anyone willing to write can be taught to essay their life on the page, to think through a specific experience, write about it using traditional narrative building techniques, and then drop into that concrete experience the ladder of abstraction. With practice, the writer learns to climb up the ladder in awareness to find the highest rung from which vision may be seen. In creative nonfiction, a story is built from the material of the past, moments that linger in mind or experiences that are unredeemed are dropped onto the page, essayed, tried out for meaning, ladders of abstraction extended upward to seek out the highest possible view. A form is circumscribed, and then others can be invited into that story, perhaps to discover something they couldn't see due to their own blind spot. And together, we work toward a shared vision for the whole, sharing, listening deeply, entering willingly into the prison of another with the intent to liberate and be liberated. Story can lead to an expanded sense of planetary relationships, where we stand aligned and in connection with lives in all directions, and where the mind as an organ of vision registers impression to unravel purpose. Story can lead to a sense of intelligent supervision, where we sense the will at work in the focused control not only of the past, but of our daily lives. And story orients us to the needs of humanity and our shared planetary endeavor. I'll ascend the ladder of abstraction one last time before I come down to dismount. We're told that the astral plane is the shadow of the monad, a definition that warrants some unpacking. In every scary movie, the shadow gives away the villain's approach. Peter Pan's shadow was always up to naughtiness and no good. Psychologists often do shadow work to help people contend with their negative emotions. Archetypes of the shadow are fearful, and the shadow seems to appear only to be cast away. But what else does the shadow indicate? We need only look up into the night sky to see that shadow reveals the movement in our solar system. We track and observe the shadow of the moon to understand patterns and interludes of approach. We know the moon doesn't generate a source of life force, rather it indicates one. And we can observe We can observe it to understand how this works. Perhaps stories and their emotionality can be observed in a similar way, to recognize a larger source at work shining behind our lives. And this is why I think healing narrative for end-of-life care could be really effective. It has the potential to transmute experience and knowledge into wisdom and provide for a peaceful passing. This is why restorative narrative for news reporting could also be effective. It has the potential to reveal not only the moment of crisis, but also the renewed life that comes from it. If the astral plane is the shadow of the monad, perhaps that is the place we can look through to make an approach to our shared story, toward our next solar system. We are uniquely prepared to face the turmoil in the astral plane, which the Tibetans said is caused by the descent of Christ energy from the Buddhic to the astral plane. This creates a reservoir of spiritual force of which the hierarchy can avail itself as it proceeds toward externalization. We're urged to work and let that penetrating energy find a channel through which it can flow, that we may come to, this is a quote from Treatise on Cosmic Fire, the divine truth that the whole life and expression of the solar logos will only be possible, and his purpose only be revealed when he has brought each atomic unit to the stage of self-realization. Page 1217. Life rendered through reflection, interpretation, and integration allows an individual to extract from experience the essence of understanding. An additional quota of light is then shared with the group, and we integrate into waking consciousness the matter which resides in the shadow of experience. Our little lives, the stories we tell, all the experiences we have are the means, not the goal. It is that which experience has the potential to reveal, which is the goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isha. That was such an eloquent and compassionate and rich talk. So thank you. It was incredible. We do have some time for questions or comments if anybody would like to make some. We have several hands raised already. Wendy Boyd, go ahead. You're still muted. I'm not sure why I can't unmute people, but let's try one more time. So Wendy, I'm not sure why I can't. Maybe you can unmute yourself, Wendy. Okay, we'll come back to you. Perhaps it'll work in a bit. Diane, do you have a comment or a question?
Yes. Hi. This is Diane Rogers, and I just wanted to say, as a soul living this experience in the body of a Black woman, I have such an appreciation, Isha, for your efforts and your courage and your selfless service to open yourself to explore the experience of racism and your intelligent expression of and your upfront personal participation, which has given you a clear view of the situation. Your understanding of the mental health issues that plague so many of the populace today also has brought about another area of racism, and it's an explosion of that society in America. I just wanted to say, by your experience and expression, it seems to be opening up awareness and consciousness of the white races in America and the rest of the planet, of those within the white race, because a recognition that there is no separation, and that in order for us to truly evolve, the darkness and of isolation and racism must be addressed and resolved in order for the elevation of consciousness to take place for all of us. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And thank you for sharing your comment.
Thanks, Diane. Dominic, go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah,
Can
we
you hear
can
me?
hear you. We can
Okay.
hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you,
Hello,
Isha. Hi, Isha. How you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. It's interesting you were talking about essays because I've just been reading a book of essays by the Canadian poet Robert Bringhurst called The Tree of Meaning. I just wanted to share a very short passage from it about story.
Please.
People have tried to tell me that language is the source and basis of poetry. I'm pretty sure that's backwards. Language is what thought and poetry produce, and stories are the fruit that language bears. You and I are stories told in ribonucleic acid. The Iliad is a story told in Greek. Stories are pretty ingenious at getting themselves told. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Who was that author again?
I'll put it in the chat
Oh,
so
good.
that, yep.